All right, so are you ready to dive into some pretty wild claims about how Canada handled the pandemic?
Oh, yeah. Sounds intriguing.
You know all those rumors going around about quarantine camps in Canada?
Yeah, I remember hearing something about that.
Well, there's this article called Canadian Corona Concentration Camps. And let me tell you,
Whoa.
yeah, the title's pretty intense, but we're going to break it all down together, look at the evidence, and see what's what. We've got invoices for riot gear leaked emails hinting at some crazy agenda.
Sounds like a deep dive.
Oh, it is for sure.
The author of this article doesn't hold back at all. They basically say that Canada's pandemic response was like a fast track to authoritarianism.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
What exactly do they mean by authoritarian?
Well, they point to a few things like the massive debt, the contact tracing programs, and they even bring up the possibility of mandatory vaccinations and those digital health passports.
Right, and they're saying that all of that is evidence of an authoritarian government.
Basically, they argue that it creates a system where people are constantly being watched and controlled, and that there could be consequences for anyone who doesn't comply.
Interesting. And they bring up Theresa Tam, Canada's top public health official, right?
Yes. They mention some of her past statements about mandatory vaccines and potential consequences for people who refuse them, which definitely plays into this whole narrative.
So it's like her words are being used to support this idea of an authoritarian government.
Exactly. On one hand, you could say she's just being realistic about the challenges of public health.
Sure.
But on the other hand, her statements definitely raise some eyebrows, especially for people who are already worried about the government having too much power.
Right, it's a sensitive topic for sure.
Definitely. And the author makes this really interesting connection back to the post 9/11 era. You know how a lot of security measures were put in place after that?
Yeah.
Well, they argue that those measures often came at the expense of personal freedoms.
It makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How much freedom are we willing to give up in the name of safety?
That's the big question, isn't it? Is there a point where it becomes too much?
It's something we all have to grapple with, for sure.
Absolutely.
But okay, so things get even more interesting when the article starts talking about the alleged quarantine camps.
Ah, yes. The heart of the conspiracy.
Right, this is where it gets really wild.
So there's this member of provincial parliament named Randy Hillier,
Oh yeah, I've heard of him.
and he found these government invoices for what they're calling quarantine isolation camps.
What?
Yeah. He even brought it up during a parliamentary inquiry, which you can actually find online if you're curious.
Whoa, hold on. We'll definitely have to link that in the show notes.
Absolutely. It's pretty fascinating to watch, especially when you see what's on those invoices.
Mm-hmm.
Riot control equipment, weapons, the whole shebang. If you're already leaning towards believing in a conspiracy, this is like adding fuel to the fire.
No kidding.
Yeah.
So what did the government say about these invoices?
Well, that's the thing. Their explanation kept changing. First, they said it was for international travelers who needed to quarantine.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then they said it was for the homeless population.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, they just said it was for numerous other reasons.
Numerous other reasons. That's not very specific. It's almost like they're trying to avoid giving a straight answer.
Yeah, it definitely raises some red flags. Why be so vague about it? What are these mysterious other reasons?
It just makes you more suspicious, right?
Exactly. And that's where this alleged leaked email from a Liberal Party member comes in. This email outlines a plan that is, well, let's just say it's pretty out there.
Okay, I'm all ears. What does this email say?
So it claims that those lockdowns back in 2021, they were actually intentional. Like the government purposely dragged them out to wreck the economy and force Canada to default on its debt.
Wait, so they're saying the government wanted the economy to crash?
That's what the email claims. And then supposedly the IMF would come in and offer a bailout.
Okay, I've heard of this kind of conspiracy theory before.
Uh,
So the IMF bails out Canada, but there's a catch, right?
You got it. To get that bailout from the IMF, Canada would have to agree to implement a universal basic income program.
Universal basic income. That sounds pretty good, actually.
Yeah, on the surface it does. But here's the kicker. According to this email, to be eligible for this basic income, every citizen would have to agree to get vaccinated for pretty much every disease imaginable. They'd also have to give up their right to own private property.
Whoa, hold on. So it's like trading your freedom for a guaranteed income.
That's what the email suggests. And it gets even wilder. Anyone who refuses these conditions would be labeled a public health threat.
Seriously?
Yeah, they'd lose all their assets and get shipped off to, you guessed it, one of those supposed quarantine camps.
So this is getting pretty intense. But before we go any further, we have to acknowledge that the authenticity of this email hasn't been verified right.
Right. We have to be careful about jumping to conclusions.
No.
It's impossible to say for sure if this email is real or if it actually reflects any real plans from the government.
So could all be a hoax.
It's definitely a possibility. But here's the thing. Even if it is fake, it's still out there circulating online and it's resonating with people who are already skeptical of the government.
Right. It plays into those existing fears about the government having too much power.
Exactly. Whether it's a real threat or just a made-up story, the fact that it's spreading so widely tells us something about the current climate.
It's like this email is a symptom of a much bigger issue. Distrust in authority.
Exactly.
And what's even more interesting is how the government has responded, or rather, how they haven't responded.
Yeah, it's been pretty quiet on their end.
Right. They're basically saying, nothing to see here, folks, move along.
The CBC, which is Canada's national broadcaster, even did a segment trying to debunk this whole conspiracy theory.
Oh, really?
But they didn't actually debunk anything specific. Their main argument was just trust the reliable sources, which in this case means trust the government.
But when there are all these unanswered questions and conflicting explanations, it's not exactly reassuring, is it?
Not really. It's like they're saying just believe us and don't worry about the details.
And the author of the article makes a good point. Even if these fears are totally unfounded, shouldn't a government address them directly?
It does seem like the more transparent approach, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it makes you wonder why they're being so silent about it. Why not just come out and clearly refute these claims if they're so easily disproven?
That's a valid question. Yeah, it almost makes you wonder if they're not saying anything because they're worried about giving it more attention.
Right, like they don't want to legitimize these claims by addressing them directly.
Exactly. And the author brings up a good point. They say if these claims were totally bogus, the government could easily shut them down with some solid evidence.
They even provide a bunch of links in the article to government invoices and other sources to support their argument.
Oh, yeah, we should definitely include those in the show notes.
Absolutely. We'll make sure our listeners can check them out for themselves.
So instead of being transparent and having a conversation with people about these concerns, the government's just staying silent and kind of dismissing everything.
It's like they're saying, just trust us and don't ask any questions.
Right. Which doesn't exactly inspire confidence, does it?
Not really.
Yeah.
So where do you stand on all of this? Is there any real cause for concern, or is this all just conspiracy theory hype?
Honestly, it's tough to say for sure. There are definitely some unanswered questions, and the government's lack of transparency is concerning.
Yeah, even if some of these claims haven't been proven, the anxieties they're tapping into are very real.
Absolutely. It's like this whole thing has become a lightning rod for people's fears about government overreach and the erosion of individual freedoms.
It makes you think about how we navigate information in this day and age when there's so much distrust of authority figures.
It's a huge challenge, and it raises the question of what responsibility the government has in addressing these fears, even the ones they might consider baseless.
Right, because ignoring them doesn't make them go away. It just creates more suspicion.
Exactly. And here's something else to ponder. What would it actually take to completely debunk this whole theory? And why hasn't that happened yet?
That's a great point. If it's all just a bunch of nonsense, why hasn't anyone definitively proven that?
The lack of a clear debunking almost makes it more intriguing, doesn't it?
It definitely adds another layer to the mystery.
This deep dive has really taken us down the rabbit hole, hasn't it? We're not just looking at the claims themselves, but also at the bigger picture of distrust, misinformation, and the power dynamics between governments and their citizens.
It's like we're walking a tightrope here. On one hand, it's easy to dismiss this as just another crazy conspiracy theory.
But on the other hand, the government's lack of transparency is definitely a cause for concern.
It feeds into those deep-seated fears about being controlled or even imprisoned against your will.
Exactly. And it's not just about physical camps, it's about the potential for governments to abuse their power and take away people's freedoms in the name of safety or security.
And we can't forget the historical context here. History is full of examples of governments rounding people up and putting them in camps, and it rarely ends well.
It's a reminder that we have to be vigilant about protecting our individual liberties and holding our leaders accountable.
So what can we do if the government is being secretive? How do we get to the bottom of this? How do we find out the truth?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We have to keep asking questions, keep demanding answers, and keep shining a light on anything that seems suspicious.
We can't just blindly accept what we're told. We have to be critical thinkers, analyze information carefully, and consider different perspectives.
And we have to be careful about where we get our information from. There's so much misinformation out there, especially online.
It's easy to get caught up in echo chambers where we're only exposed to information that confirms our existing beliefs.
Right. We need to diversify our sources, fact-check everything, and be wary of anything that sounds too good or too bad to be true.
And maybe if enough people start asking the right questions, the government will finally feel pressured to be more transparent.
I hope so, because ultimately this isn't just about quarantine camps, it's about the fundamental principles of freedom, democracy, and transparency.
And those are values worth fighting for.
Couldn't agree more. If you're listening out there and this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, don't stop here. Do your own research. Check out the links we'll provide in the show notes and come to your own conclusions.
Exactly. Don't just take our word for it. Think for yourself. Stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.
Well said. This conversation needs to continue. Now, we've covered a lot of ground already. The author's claims, the evidence, the government's response or lack thereof, and the bigger implications of it all. But there's one piece of this puzzle we haven't fully explored yet.
You're talking about that alleged leaked email, right? The one with the whole plan for a totalitarian takeover of Canada.
Exactly. We mentioned it earlier, but I think it deserves a closer look. Even if it's a fake, it's still a fascinating document.
It's like a window into the fears and anxieties that are so prevalent right now.
It taps into those deep-seated worries about the loss of privacy, the rise of surveillance technology, and the potential for governments to use crises like pandemics to grab more power.
Okay, so let's break it down. The email claims that the Canadian government deliberately prolonged the lockdowns back in 2021 to cripple the economy and force the country into default.
And then supposedly the IMF would come in with a bailout, but with some pretty big strings attached.
Right.
To get this bailout, Canada would have to implement a universal basic income program, which, sounds pretty good at first glance.
Yeah, like who wouldn't want a guaranteed income?
Exactly. But then you dig a little deeper, and the email claims that to actually qualify for this basic income, every citizen would have to agree to get vaccinated for like every disease under the sun, and they'd have to give up their right to own private property.
So essentially, you're trading your freedom for financial security.
Yeah, it's a pretty stark choice, isn't it? And it gets even crazier. The email says anyone who refuses those conditions would be considered a danger to public health. They'd lose all their assets and get sent off to one of those quarantine camps we talked about earlier.
Wow, that's pretty disturbing stuff. But again, we have to remember that we don't know for sure if this email is authentic.
Right, we can't just take it at face value. There's no way to verify where it came from or if it actually reflects any real government plans.
So it could all just be a big elaborate hoax.
It's definitely possible, but even if it is fake, it's still out there spreading online, and it's clearly resonating with people who are already suspicious of the government.
Right, it feeds into those existing fears and anxieties.
Exactly, and whether it's a real threat or a manufactured fear, the fact that this email is circulating so widely tells us something about the current climate.
It's a reflection of the deep distrust that many people feel towards authority figures and institutions.
Absolutely, and it raises some important questions about why this distrust exists and how we can address it.
I think part of the problem is the sheer amount of information we're exposed to these days. It's hard to know what to believe, who to trust, especially when official sources aren't always transparent or forthcoming.
Yeah, and social media definitely plays a role too. It's become an echo chamber where misinformation can spread like wildfire and conspiracy theories can really take root.
So how do we combat that? How do we promote critical thinking and responsible information sharing?
It's a tough challenge, but I think it starts with media literacy, teaching people how to evaluate sources, look for bias, and recognize the signs of disinformation.
And it's also important to create spaces for open and respectful dialogue where people can engage with different perspectives even if they disagree.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between skepticism and open-mindedness, being discerning without becoming completely cynical.
And maybe, just maybe, if we can achieve that, we can start to rebuild trust in our institutions and create a more informed and engaged citizenry.
It's a long road, but I think it's a goal worth striving for.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Canadian quarantine camps and conspiracy theories, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners will remember?
Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. Don't be afraid to question the official narrative, but always approach information with a critical eye. Do your own research, think for yourself, and come to your own conclusions.
That's great advice. And if something sounds too crazy to be true, well, it just might be. But then again, sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction.
Exactly. That's what keeps things interesting.
Well, thanks for joining us on this journey down the rabbit hole. It's been a wild ride.
It has been, and thanks for having me.
To all our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep searching, and keep the conversation going. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.